Schedule this morning, so I want to get started on time. My name is Graeme Robertson, and I'm going to be imposing order on Putinism this morning. We have an outstanding list of speakers. Hilary Appel from Claremont, McKenna College. Hi. Vladimir Gehlbach from the European University of St. Petersburg and the University of Helsinki. Gehlbach from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Mark Kramer from Harvard. Nikolay Petrov from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and Brian Taylor from Syracuse University. This is a fabulous lineup. I could listen to each one of these people all day long, so I'm going to give them 8 minutes instead. Please try and stick closely to the 8 minutes. I'll tell you after 5, and then we've got a minute left. So without further ado, we'll go in the order in the program, and I'd like to invite Hilary Appel to kick us off.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming to the breakout sessions, and thank you to the organizers, Corey and Henry, the directors. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you to my co-author, Vladimir Gehlbach. At the request of our esteemed organizers, we are not co-presenting, but I will present, and Hilary will take over during Q&A. While this arrangement allows me the tempting and rather mischievous possibility of making outlandish claims which he then has to respond to, I'll do my best to defend and present the points that we raised in our memo together. We wrote a memo, I think about June, earlier in the summer, because we were struck by a growing trend in Russian economic discourse and policy making in which economic growth and development were appearing to be more and more subordinate to geopolitical goals and patriotic posturing. In fact, this is not necessarily new. We certainly have seen the way natural resources, gas and oil in particular, have been used for geopolitical aims for quite some time. But it seemed at the same time that there's something new that was happening with the accumulation of sometimes major and sometimes minor and rather petty self-defeating forms of geopolitical economic policy making. As you know, when the Western countries imposed targeted sanctions on Russia, restricting access for Russian elites and companies to capital as well as travel, the Kremlin responded with self-imposed counter-sanctions. And when we wrote the memo, these included, of course, the import bans on foreign food products, which caused a steep rise in consumer prices. Since that time, the government has not only banned and confiscated agricultural products from a growing group of Western countries, but it's also made a rather dramatic show of destroying the food contraband, as many of you are aware of. And of course, there have been many other examples of self-inflicted, self-imposed counter-sanctions and bans. For example, the Dutch flowers or the import bans on medical equipment, medicine, contraception, and so on. There were also other protectionist policies adopted this year, such as the new law on preferential use of Russian software and state companies, which was adopted in 2015, and special taxes on foreign films. And not only were there imports banned, but also many proposals for export bans, which in some ways is rather surprising, like of timber to Finland, which followed after, in fact, this proposal was called for to ban timber exports from Russia to Finland after several Duma deputies were denied access to an OSCE assembly meeting in Helsinki, that this would be the appropriate response, a response which would cost almost $500 million worth of exports to the Russian timber industry alone. And in fact, as you know, the ban on flowers resulted, or the proposal came about as a result of Netherlands and 4 other countries making proposals to the UN Security Council to establish a UN tribunal to prosecute parties responsible for the shooting down of the Malaysian Airlines in July 2014 over the Donbass. So certainly we know that Russia, this is not new, it's engaged in all sorts of geopolitical use of its resources, and even in these sort of small, I would say petty, targeted ways. For example, in 2006, the ban on wine imports from Moldova and Georgia, or temporarily meat from Poland, or canned fish from Latvia. So there are examples, but what we argue in our memo is that this current ban, or set of bans and counter-sanctions, is not simply a continuity of past behavior. In the past, these kinds of small bans were occasional, they were issue-specific, and they were basically with a very minor impact on Russia. At present, These responses are frequent, they are general, and they're becoming mainstream policy in Russia. And some of the current proposals and bans are actually quite grand and unrealistic. For example, the case of the Minister of Agriculture announcing that Russia will seek to achieve 100% import substitution of food products by 2025, and announcing the allocation of 2 trillion rubles to get there over 5 years. Of course, another very major example is the shift in budgetary allocations from social spending to the military, and the increase in military spending that is a long time in coming and was related to Prime Minister Kudrin's resignation in 2011, but we see that this is now also having to result in a shift of budgetary outlays from non-military sectors. So putting geopolitics increasingly before economics, we argue, has imposed concentrated costs on certain sectors. It's inconvenienced and depleted the purchasing power of the Russian citizenry and a wide swath of Russian consumers, and has placed a substantial burden on the Russian economy. And against this background of the decline of global oil prices and economic contraction, this new approach to policymaking has certainly contributed to great economic instability. It's eviscerated investor confidence, and it's also contributed to capital flight. The self-imposed sanctions and import substitution has also led to spikes in inflation, especially in food products, and also has led to low-quality, domestically produced food substitutes. So why is it that geopolitics increasingly prevailed over economic considerations in Russian policymaking as of late? And we consider several explanations that are out there. First, in the spirit of neo-Kremlinology, we think about this and look at how this is related to perhaps the decisive victory of the Siloviki over economic liberals in Russia in the battle for the heart and mind, I would say, of President Putin. A second explanation that is out there is following Putin's third term, and of course the Sochi Olympics and the crisis in Ukraine. There appears to be a new mindset, a new worldview among political elites. It's based upon a conceptualization of the global order of politics and economics as a zero-sum game, we argue. That any gain for one side implies a loss for the other, and the world is divided into friends and enemies, and maximizing the losses of your enemies necessarily benefits oneself. So this new mindset is something that we've been focused on in the memo. And that in the Russian case, perceptions of a kind of existential threat to the country and its rulers, as well as a desire for revenge for losses in the immediate post-Cold War period, has somehow this mindset allowed many leaders to speak out in a very strong terms that the U.S. is almost conspiratorially aiming to take over Russian natural resources, and that the international sanctions were somehow encouraged to overthrow Russia's political regime via a kind of color revolution. So that's a second explanation that we examine in the memo, the zero-sum mentality, which has led to these tit-for-tat responses to all real or imagined challenges from the West. And the third reason for this geopolitical thinking overtaking sort of rational policymaking is a reflection of, or a shift of, the political climate in Russia. So these bans are made possible by the lack of resistance or protest from the domestic losers of these bans. The argument that free trade is somehow beneficial is dismissed as anti-Russian or pro-Western. And the acquiescence by not only the general population, but also from representatives of affected industrial sectors serves to legitimate the government's new approach to economic decision-making. And given the current political climate, decision makers are feeling quite free to ignore the negative consequences of these small and large economic decisions. To finish, I'll mention that in the memo, we also note that as much as this is geopolitically driven, it's also sustained by the fact that we see an emergence of a new set of interest groups that are actually the beneficiaries of this approach. So in a sense, that helps to sustain this new foreign or geopolitically driven economic policy making, whether that be the military, the agricultural sector, or of course areas like, as I mentioned, film or software. So we now see that there's this new low-level equilibrium in which the new Russian economic model is driven by foreign policy aims, but encouraged independently by a newly emerging coalition of interests in Russia. Thank you.
Next, we'll have Scott Gehlbach from the University of Wisconsin.
Okay, thanks very much. So this is joint work with Tim Fry at Columbia, Kyle Markart, who's a Wisconsin grad, currently doing a postdoc at the VDEM Institute, and John Reuter at UW-Milwaukee. So the question of this paper is Putin's popularity. And so Putin's official approval ratings, as probably all of us in this room know, have been quite consistently strong. So from the beginning of his presidency, or even a little bit before his presidency, through the period of his prime ministership and then into his second presidency, his approval ratings have never really dipped below 60%. We've seen an increase in approval ratings since the crisis in Crimea and Ukraine, but throughout his time in power, they've been quite strong. The question is whether approval ratings capture actual approval for Vladimir Putin. So there are perhaps reasons to believe that they do. So on the one hand, there's some pretty convincing empirical work by Dan Treisman at UCLA, who shows that the approval ratings of both Yeltsin and Putin are quite responsive to people's perceptions of the state of the economy. For most of Putin's time in power, Russia has experienced economic growth. There's a question whether the president should be getting credit for this or not, but that's a question almost everywhere. And then more recently, as economic growth has disappeared, perhaps the basis for Putin's support has shifted to a nationalist sentiment brought on by the war in Ukraine and so forth. Also, these are approval ratings that one sees very similar approval ratings regardless of the polling agency that's doing the survey work. So some of the polling agencies are state-owned, but not all of them are. So the Levada Center, which many of us know, well-respected independent organization, has consistently found very high approval ratings for Putin. Those are the Levada Center ratings that we saw in the previous slide. On the other hand, there are perhaps reasons to be skeptical. So first of all, it could be that in an increasingly authoritarian environment, that individuals are simply afraid to report what they perceive to be dangerous political attitudes to outsiders who knock on their door and ask what they think. So as Ben Judah recently put it, polls in Russia, these are not polls of approval, but polls of fear. Alternatively, and not mutually exclusively, it's possible that individuals simply feel that expressing support for Putin is the right thing to do, it's a socially acceptable attitude to have, and so therefore they would be less likely to indicate that they don't support Putin in an opinion poll. Okay, so we can't really get at these questions just by asking people directly whether they support Putin or not. So in this paper we do something different. So we put a series of questions in the field in 2 rounds of the Levada Center's monthly Courier survey. So this is a nationally representative survey. It's carried out once a month. We did this in January and March of this year. So we utilized the standard question that's been on every Levada Center survey as long as Putin has held power. So the standard question is, in general, do you support or not support the activities of Vladimir Putin? That's the way the approval question is phrased. But then in addition, we added to the survey, to each round of the survey, a pair of what are called list experiments. So this is, the jargon is this is an example of the item count technique in survey research. And so list experiments in brief are a type of survey experiment. So they're an experiment that's embedded in the survey. So some respondents randomly chosen receive one version of a question, and other respondents randomly chosen receive a different version of the question. Now, so list experiments, I'll be more concrete in a second here, but list experiments provide respondents the opportunity to reveal their opinion or behavior on a sensitive topic while maintaining plausible deniability. So there have been numerous applications of list experiments in political science, including things like vote buying in Lebanon, that sort of thing. Okay, so I think the best way to describe a list experiment is to give you an example. So here's a classic example from the literature. It's a paper from about 20 years ago on racial attitudes in the New South. Okay, so the question of the paper was whether or not respondents might harbor racist attitudes that they would be afraid of revealing to survey enumerators. And so the particular question in this experiment was whether or not respondents would be made angry or upset by a black family moving in next door. And so rather than ask them that question directly, respondents are given one of two versions of a list. Okay, so half of the respondents, the control group, receive a version of a list. So they're told, there are certain things that sometimes make people angry or upset. So I'm going to read you a list, and I want you to tell me how many of the items, so not which items, but how many of the items on the list make you angry or upset. Okay, so the control group receives a list of 3 items. So the federal government increasing the tax on gasoline, professional athletes getting million-dollar contracts, and large corporations polluting the environment. The treatment group receives the same list of 3 items plus the 4th item, the potentially sensitive item, so a black family moving in next door. And so respondents in both groups are asked how many of the items on the list would make you angry or upset. And so then the difference between the two can be used as an estimate of the proportion of respondents who actually harbor the sensitive attitude. So in this case, Southern respondents in the treatment group reported that on average 2.37 items on the list made them angry or upset, whereas those in the control group reported that 1.95 items did, for an estimate that 42% of Southern respondents would be angered or upset by a black family moving in next door. Okay, so what did we do? So we had 2 versions of a list experiment intended to get at approval for Vladimir Putin. Okay, so the first version of the experiment, so take a look at this list of politicians and tell me for how many you generally support their activities. And they're given a list of historical leaders of Russia or the Soviet Union. So the control group gets the first 3, Stalin, Brezhnev, Yeltsin. The treatment group also gets Vladimir Putin. They're asked, do you support none, 1, 2, 3, or in the case of the treatment group, 4 of their activities. Second list experiment is very similar in structure, but we have contemporary rather than historical political figures. So Vladimir Zhirinovsky, Gennady Zyuganov, Sergei Mironov, and then in the treatment group, Vladimir Putin. Okay, so what do we find? So in January 2015, the direct question, so do you support the activities of Vladimir Putin, indicates that about 86% of respondents support Vladimir Putin. The historical list experiment, so looking at the difference between the number of items supported by respondents in the treatment group versus those in the control group, indicates that about 79% support Putin. The contemporary list experiment, very similar, about 81%. So in March, we see very similar results both for the direct question and for the historical and the contemporary list experiments. So across survey waves, across question designs, then we see very similar results. So perhaps some evidence of preference falsification going on among survey respondents, but not large in magnitude. Okay, so there are possible sources of bias, various caveats that one might have. Let me just reveal a couple, or mention a couple very quickly. So the first is, you sort of think about it, the point of the list experiment is to give people the opportunity to reveal their attitudes while maintaining plausible deniability. But what happens to the folks who say that they don't support any of the figures on the list? Then they're implicitly revealing that they do not support Putin. And so you might be concerned that people who don't support Putin or anybody else would say they support one figure on the list so as to hide the fact that they don't support Putin. And so we have to worry about those who indicate that they support 1 out of the 4 individuals on the list in the treatment group. And so about 1/3 of respondents to both the historical and the contemporary experiments do. On the other hand, and working the other direction, we have to worry about the fact that individuals might count people differently in the treatment group than they did in the control group. So sort of think about, do you like Sergei Mironov or not? So if Putin's not on the list, yeah, sure, I like Mironov. Whereas you add Putin to the list, then Mironov perhaps doesn't look so good, and you're less likely to include him in your count. And so that would suggest a negative bias in our support for estimate of support for Putin. So to some extent, these are offsetting effects, and so to the extent that each is present, we perhaps don't have to worry about it so much, but those are important caveats, I think. So bottom line, we find about 80% support for Putin in the list experiments. These might be either over or underestimates, but in any event, it appears that the bulk of support for Putin is genuine. Just 2 other caveats. This doesn't mean, of course, that support is not manipulated in some sense, that people might not be responsive to media bias and so forth. And support might be soft, it might evaporate very quickly, but in any event, it appears that for the most part, individuals are feel comfortable reporting truthfully what they think about Vladimir Putin. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Next up, we're going to hear from Mark Kramer from Harvard University.
I'm not gonna be using PowerPoint. I'm gonna mostly because the time is so tight. The topic that I'm investigating here is high-level corruption in Russia, which is quite different from low-level corruption. Low-level corruption tends to affect people more visibly and directly in their daily lives. It's not to say the impact is any less important, though. And so if I were giving a presentation on low-level corruption, it might have different implications for what I'll be talking about in focusing on high-level corruption. The current system in Russia is basically the same pattern that Richard Pipes identified a long time ago, talking about hundreds of years of Russian history, one in patrimonialism, one in a system in which the central state is seen as the personal domain of the ruler or a few rulers who make no distinction between public and private property, and are seen by their followers as having authority to dispose of all property as they see fit. As you look at Russia today, that is basically the same pattern. For a while, 20 years or so ago, there was hope that that would diminish or gradually, at least possibly even disappear, but clearly during the Putin era it has become much more entrenched, and at this point I think is going to be very hard to get rid of for reasons I'll discuss. The high-level corruption has, though, one of the ways of trying to get rid of it or counter it is to have a genuine a political system in which there's genuine competition and people can be held to account. So part of the problem during the Putin era, as compared to, say, the Yeltsin era, is that meaningful political competition has disappeared. Real politics is largely absent now in Russia. It's not to say it couldn't return, but certainly over the past decade and a half, national elections have been largely pro forma. The parliament has been subordinated to the executive's role, which again is quite a contrast to the Yeltsin period. Political parties are mostly non-substantive. National television's back under state control, and so forth. Each of those elements and others potentially would be a way of drawing attention to high-level corruption and highlighting the adverse impact of it. And the fact that they don't exist any longer partly accounts for why the problem is as intense and entrenched as it is. The high-level corruption takes numerous forms, which I won't go into for want of time here. I discussed these in the paper, but essentially involving diversion of state funds for private use, appropriation of public property and assets for private gain, illicit use of state services for private purposes, a failure to declare income, especially income from foreign assets and bank accounts, influence peddling, and numerous other forms. I won't go into the way that these are divided currently among the Russian elite under Putin, but still, each of those forms is evident. In looking, though, at the prospects for doing something about this is the prospects, again, partly for the reasons that Scott just discussed, that Putin's standing, despite revelations of high-level corruption, it's not for want of information. If you want to find out in Russia about the extent of high-level corruption, you can log on to the internet, or even in some non-internet sources, and find quite extensive discussions of this. If you pick up, for example, an issue of the weekly New Times, you will find extensive discussion of high-level corruption in Russia. And New Times is still on sale at least in major cities in Russia. So it's not for want of information, it's instead that the impact of it excuse me, on people's daily lives is concealed in many respects. It doesn't have the direct, vivid impact that low-level corruption does. So as you look at opinion polls, even though people cite corruption as a major problem, something they're irritated about, they really have in mind much more the low-level corruption. You can have a figure like Alexei Navalny, who's done excellent work on his blog in coming up with detailed evidence about high-level corruption. But the repeated detentions and prosecutions of him have undoubtedly caused Russian journalists and political activists to think twice about pursuing that topic. And again, it's not to say, though, that want of information is the major problem. It's instead that pattern of patrimonialism that I mentioned is a two-way street, that it does depend on what the what the public attitude is to it, the political system amid high-level corruption. And this is where, again, to go to the topic that Scott Gehlbach was discussing, is Putin's popularity has been unaffected by this issue. Each time there is a revelation, fairly prominent revelation of high-level corruption, including some of Putin's closest aides, it hasn't affected Putin's. I went through and looked at this systematically to try to figure out, including with a lag variable, to try to figure out whether it affects Putin's popularity, and it simply doesn't. So that means that to the extent that there isn't greater public demand for dealing with this problem, it is a problem that is likely to persist, and so long as Putin is on the scene, at least, it's hard to see how it could be removed through action from above. So the combination of that, the lack of public demand and the absence of any incentive at the top to deal with it except on a highly selective basis it leads me to a very gloomy conclusion about where this problem will exist in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Next up, we have Nikolay Petrov from the Higher School of Economics in Moscow.
It was reminded by Mark that we should look back at those studies and publications which are describing old-fashioned imperial Russia, and I would represent approach coming from Sovietology rather than from political science, and I would speak about decision-making in new Putin's Russia. And I'll make just 5 brief points. The first one is that present-day Russia is entirely new in terms of the political regime. In many different ways, it's the new one. And what is important is the fact that Putin, with his new legitimacy which is not coming from elections but is of military chieftain, is much less dependent from political elites, and political elites are much more dependent from him, and it can be clearly seen in how elections are going on in present-day Russia. So until very recently, and it's not a kind of shameless self-promotion. We've published a book. I'm not represented as an author here, but this is about Russia after 2014 and how it looks and what should be awaited from it in the nearest future. So until recently, we were saying that Putin is not a Tsar. He is rather chairman of the board, and he should do whatever major elites want from him. Now it's different, and Putin is partly a Tsar to a vast extent, meaning that Sovietological approaches are very important now. So decision-making all the time was very weak element of the system due to understandable reasons. Unlike in the Soviet Union, there are no formats where representatives of major elites can meet all together and can work out a compromise. Putin deals with all of them on bilateral basis, meaning that decisions are not made for pretty long. It did work somehow at a time, political time was passing not that fast. Now it doesn't work at all, in a sense that decisions should be made quickly, and the risk either to make bad decision or not to make right decision in time is increasing, and there are clear signs that some decisions are wrong. We are dealing in this and previous books with different elite schemes. I would not overload you with all these Russian names. I would only emphasize that those who are important decision makers in present-day Russia can be described as board members, first of all, shareholders, and there is a whole bunch of these guys as managers and as experts. And for a while it was possible to combine these roles. What we see now, and the good example is Yakunin's replacement as the head of Russian railroads, is separation of political heavyweights, of board members from managers. Separation and cutting off administrative resource they do control. This is not entirely new, and it had happened in 2007 when Putin cut off administrative resource of Patrushev and appointed Bortnikov, who in no sense did replace Patrushev. So Patrushev kept his political weight, Bortnikov got administrative resources, and he is a manager, while Patrushev can be seen as minor shareholder perhaps. My next point is about increasing inner elite competition, and there are several reasons why it's increasing. One is shrinking of the pie to be shared by major elite clans, and it leads to intensifying competition, if not fight, between major elite clans. Second reason is managed conflict. It was mentioned that Siloviki are now more important, and at a time of war, Siloviki are more important than economists in any country, meaning that in order to keep control over them, there should be managed conflicts among them, and this is not entirely new element, but it's very, the scale of this conflict within Siloviki camp between different agencies is increasing. The problem is that the lack of resources doesn't lead to reward any member of inner elite circle who is losing part of his influence. And this is important thing to be taken into account when speaking about scenarios for the future. Veto power. Putin does have veto power, but he practices this veto power in a very different way now, due to the fact that there is no way to reach compromise between major elite clans over serious decisions. Some of clans are moving on their own. So Putin can stop these, but in spite of the fact that he's more influential player than he used to be earlier, the cost of this veto is very high. It's much higher than it used to be when he could stop elites from making any moves. And my last item, my last point is about Crimea. There was Bloomberg and then New York Times publication speaking about the fact that decision has been made by Siloviki guys, including Bortnikov, Patrushev, and so on. Well, I would say that it's different from reality. And in my view, there were three decisions made. The first decision has been made in May 2012, after Bolotnaya protests, when it was decided that there is no way to fix the political crisis by those means which had been used earlier, by buying loyalty, because the country was already facing certain economic troubles, and because this scheme did show its inefficiency in Moscow, where the money invested was biggest of all. So it was decided that time to switch to different kind of legitimacy in order to fix the political crisis. And what we see is step-by-step realization of this plan starting from May 2012. And this decision should be made by major shareholders, because it was extremely important decision about it was strategic decision which was realized a while later. So then there was a more practical decision made in summer 2013 when Ukraine should sign this treaty with European Union, and it was about how to react, and it was once again decision made by shareholders together with certain managers, because Siloviki should be very important in implementing this decision. And finally, there was decision to take, to annex Crimea, which could be made by Siloviki, but it was mere realization of strategic decisions made by internal circle of Putin's elite. And to finish on positive note, I would say that, in my view, there is no way for large-scale political protests to put an end to the regime in its present shape. What will happen? Regime will kill itself by itself due to the fact that inefficiency of decision-making and inevitability of very serious inner-elite conflicts and mistakes made by the regime will increase, and I would say that, in my view, there is no way to keep it in present shape for longer than till the next honors conference.
Chloe is guaranteed an audience for the next winner's and finally, we have Brian Taylor from Syracuse University.
All right, thanks, Graeme. Thanks, everyone. This talk is completely data empty, so if you're hoping for data, you'll have to wait for the Q&A. What I'm proposing in this memo and in this talk is a way of thinking about a way of thinking in the Kremlin. Okay, so I'm not talking about decision-making. I'm more trying to explore what underlies the mentality that is behind decision-making. And for the old-timers in the room, calling it a code is a oblique reference to something called the Operational Code of Bolshevism, which many of us may have read a long, long time ago, right? Okay, so why does this come up? There's been a bit of a debate over the last couple of years about whether Putin's a pragmatist or an ideologue. And I think the dominant view for most of Putin's time at the pinnacle of Russian power is that he's a rational problem solver, that he's a pragmatist, the ultimate pragmatist, according to Dale Hairspring. And this way of thinking about Putin is very familiar one to almost any social scientist who likes to think of decision makers or groups or even states as rational actors that are pursuing their interests, however defined, whether it's power or money or whatever. And they go about doing this in a systematic way, and I suspect all the members of the panel would sort of broadly endorse that way of thinking about politics. More recently, though, we've had people say that Putin is an ideologue. So if Putinism BC, which is before Crimea, is pragmatic, now people are claiming that Putinism AD, which is after Donbass, has become ideological. Okay? So Alexander Sergunin, who many of us know, wrote last year that Putin has transformed himself from a pragmatist to an ideologue. Hilary earlier mentioned the new mindset in the Kremlin, and people have talked about how he's gone ideological. The argument here is that both those ways of thinking about Putinism, Putin and Putinism, which is a broader phenomenon, are wrong. He is neither a pure pragmatist nor is he a pure ideologue. So a code is both more and less than an ideology. It's more in that it involves other motives for action other than sort of rationality or ideas, and it's less in that it's not a coherent system of thought that's interconnected the way an ideology is. Although there is some interconnection I'll try and talk about. Okay? I would also suggest, I don't have time to talk about this really, but that it's not new. It goes back at least to 2004. All right. Better way of thinking about this code is Torah and Max Weber. The reason for this slide is I wanted to scare Henry Hale and Corey Well because I'm violating the second rule of Ponar's talks, which is you don't talk about social science theory. But this will be quick, okay? So Max Weber had this idea that there are actually four motives for human action. Instrumental rationality, that's what I was talking about before, right? The pragmatist. Second reason, he called value rationality, but that's basically ideas or values, something you pursue not because of some sort of means-end calculation, but because it's something you value and that you think is worthwhile, okay? Third one is what Weber called affect, or which you might call emotions. He also refers to them as feeling states. And the fourth is what he called tradition or habit. So this is ingrained habituation. These are impulses. In some sense, they're kind of pre-rational things you do without really even having to think about them. They're kind of automatic responses that you've acquired over time. Okay? So what I'm calling a code is the motives outside of those suggested by instrumental rationality. It's a combination of ideas, emotions, and habits. Okay? And I think this is a more accurate account of human action in general, and also a more accurate account of not just Putin, but of Putinism, because I think this code is shared by many of the top members of the inner circle. Okay? So now you want to know what the code is, right? How many? I got 5 minutes left, right? There it is. Okay. There's obviously room for argument about every element of this list. Okay. So I'm not going to persuade you in 5 minutes that this is the actual right template for thinking about Putinism. There's a longer version of the story if people want to see it. But I want to suggest that these are some of the things that might make up the core elements that underlie the mentality that's behind decision making. Okay? The evidence for this I'm not going to present here, but it's based on studying for 15 years, what he says, what he does, what the rest of the inner circle says and do, and talking to experts in Russia about how they understand the nature of Putinism. Okay? Some of these might be controversial, like anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism. Certainly early on in Putin's tenure, there was a different feeling coming from the Kremlin. I would suggest at least since 2004. You can see this anti-Western turn in the response to Beslan and the Orange Revolution. In terms of habits, I can't go through all of these, obviously, but I think there's a general feeling among Kremlinologists, I guess I'll call us that this is a guy who really values order and control and really dislikes instability, really just hates the word revolution or anything to do with sort of spontaneous political change. And this is obviously related to a certain status and anti-liberal ideas. All right, emotions. I want to be clear here. This is not a way of saying that Putin and Putinism are irrational. Okay? It's a way of saying that we have to think about decision makers as having a broader range of impulses than just cost-benefit calculations. And if you talk to experts, if you read sort of the literature on Russia, this notion that Russia's been disrespected, it needs to be respected as a great power, its place in the world order has not been treated fairly since the end of the Cold War. You see this running sort of throughout the commentary. If we had time, we could talk about resentment in the pretentious French way and call it ressentiment. There's a whole literature about why actors who find themselves sort of aspiring towards one goal and maybe feeling conflicted about that goal and feeling they're being judged for their status along that process come to resent the source of that goal, and there's an element of that in the whole sort of post-communist transition, if you want to use that word, in the region, and I think it's felt quite distinctly among the top elite. Vulnerability or fear, also that one's probably going to raise eyebrows, although I guess if Coley is right, they should be quite fearful. But you know, this guy's got 60%, 80% approval rating throughout his tenure. What's he got to be afraid of? But it's the issue of the lack of stable institutions, okay? And the feeling that the political elite has not found a way to manage those conflicts without it becoming a situation in which you're on the losing end, you might lose everything. So that's what I'm talking about there. So is he a pragmatist or an ideologue? He's both and neither. He's sometimes one, he's sometimes the other. And so his decisions are motivated, yes, by instrumental rationality and by circumstances, but also by values and feelings and even what I call habits here. So he's got a mentality, he's got some goals, but he doesn't have a roadmap for the future. In other words, he's a person, right, who has complex motives. So I would say the elements can reinforce each other, and so you have this idea of Russia needing to be a strong state with this sense of resentment, the need for control, leading to what's become this sort of besieged fortress mentality in Russia. And my message is that this is not something that's put out there for propaganda reasons, or this is not irrationality, but this is actually the way that the world is perceived by Putin, by Patrov, and some other top elites in Russia today. So they need strongly centralized manual control to exist in this very difficult, problematic situation that they're in. So I've got a quote from a Russian journalist who I know who's very pro-Kremlin. He wrote this before Crimea, right, BC, in 2012. Living without enemies and having a besieged fortress mentality is indeed stupid. But living in a besieged fortress and not having a besieged fortress mentality is downright idiotic. So Putin and his allies, they're not idiots, right? These are smart people. It's that their life experiences, their code, their mentality leads them to see the world in this way. And I think that's a more accurate account of what underlies the mentality behind decisions rather than strictly rational calculation or a set of ideas.